Okay, good afternoon everybody. As Peter said, my talk is going to be very different. It's going to be looking more at a historical example, which will hopefully be of interest in terms of thinking about the themes of the conference. Famously, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown took their students in 1968 from Yale to visit Las Vegas, thereby plunging that small and slightly seedy town into the forefront of architectural debate. Their aim was to show that architecture operates as a system of signs and to attack the hegemony in post-war America of what they saw as overly abstract and non-communicative architecture. The resulting book, Learning from Las Vegas in 1972, became a cornerstone of what was known as architectural postmodernism. In retrospect, perhaps a more provocative study would have been if they'd taken their students to the town of Columbus, Indiana. This is another American small town, but in the Midwest, right on the edge of the Prairie Belt. Columbus was also the company town of the Cummins engine factory, which was the world leader at that time for making diesel engines for large vehicles like lorries and trucks. The leader of the Cummins engine factory, a man called Joseph Irwin Miller, mixed his love of this small western town and its social values with an attempt to introduce an international modernist architecture to create what is possibly, in many ways, one of the most important centres for modern architecture of that period in America. It can be seen perhaps as the fourth most important centre for architecture in America in the mid-20th century, perhaps only being surpassed by New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Today, one of the town's nicknames is Athens of the Prairies. Another nickname is Mecca of Modernism. Hopefully both are meant somewhat ironically, but one is never sure. How Miller came to be the champion of contemporary architecture is a fascinating tale, and it is clear that in the short period from the mid-1950s, by creating a special fund which he called the Cummins Foundation, and which paid for architects' fees in exchange for him being able to select the architect being used for any new public building in the town, created an incredible transformation in Columbus, Indiana. It became the showcase for the leading younger American modernist architects and later on postmodernist architects. The impressive list includes Elio Saarinen, Eero Saarinen, I.M. Pei, Harry Weiss, Myron Goldsmith of Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, Kevin Roche, John Johansson, Cesar Pelli, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, Bob Stern, and perhaps, not surprisingly, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. There were many others as well. With the death of Irwin Miller in 2004, the program for Columbus, Indiana came abruptly to an end. Economic recession since 2008 has also hit the town hard. Yet it remains the paradigm of a particular vision of cultural fusion, in which, to paraphrase Miller, one could have all the benefits of being in a small town community and at the same time have the most up-to-date and sophisticated metropolitan architecture. In relation to this conference here in Limeridge, which looks at spaces of creativity for architectures outside the main centres of population, it strikes me that Columbus, Indiana is a particular case. It represents the most intensive laboratory experiment in transculturation. In this case, taking a small and seemingly peripheral town and showing how it can be transformed into a cutting-edge location for architectural design. That this building program only lasted for a few decades and is never likely to happen again in Columbus, Indiana, also provides what I think is an important insight, which is that our notions of center and periphery are essentially temporal constructs, in that they are defined by time rather than space or place. In this sense, Athens, Alexandria, Aachen, and many other towns were once the centres of architectural innovation, and yet today are relative backwaters. This observation keeps in touch with the writings of cultural geographers like Doreen Massey, who argue that every single place in the world is essentially fluid and hybrid and transitory, and as such combines global and local conditions within its locality, and then this creates the change that we see around us. Architects therefore act as the witnesses to this change of place over time. So I'll give you some facts first about Columbus, Indiana. This map shows where it is, right on the edge of the Prairie Belt, and it's a long way from any major city. Today it's got a population of 44,000 people at the last census in 2010. It's in an essentially agricultural region where corn growing is king. The town itself was founded only in the 1820s, and the railways began to arrive in 1844. Later it became a major centre for manufacturing, and today about 1/3 of all the jobs are in that industrial sector. The Cummins engine factory is by far the largest local employer. Columbus portrays itself as the classic small American town. When Joseph Irwin Miller, as we said, the head of the Cummins engine factory, decided to extend his patronage to make these changes to his hometown, he was also keen to ensure the help from preservationists and specialists in historical architecture to try to retain this centre of the hometown in its existing condition. There's some other examples. In many ways, this is the ideal that Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown were talking about when they said that Main Street is nearly almost all right. And the question is, who was J. Irwin Miller and what motivated him? This is photographs of Miller at rest and at work. I was lucky enough to interview him in 1997. By then he was already 88 years old, and he died 7 years later. He was educated at Yale and at Oxford in the early 1930s. As a confirmed Anglophile and a deeply religious person, he was one of the founders of the National Council of Churches. He was also, of course, a plutocrat and, growingly, a leading architectural creator. Socially and politically, he was a moderate conservative. Culturally, he was more ambitious. As a wealthy and powerful magnate, by the 1960s, he was even being tipped as a potential future president of the United States. And if he had done so, then like Thomas Jefferson before him, he would have brought his deep belief that architecture and high quality contemporary architecture is essential to the health of society. Miller's favourite architect was Eero Saarinen. They were close together in age and had met and become close friends in the early 1940s as a consequence of Miller's role in securing Eero's father, Elio Saarinen, to design this church, the first Christian church, which was built for the congregation of which Miller and his family were part. It was a remarkable building, but at the time it was seen as very dangerously modern and different and controversial by the local inhabitants when it opened in 1942. which showed how culturally conservative the existing condition was. This was something that Miller was determined to change. I'll show you, that's the exterior. This shows the interior with an asymmetrical plan with the doors that lead out onto a courtyard to the side, and there's community buildings around it. And this is the urban context with the square in front. It's got a bit pixelated. Miller was deeply impressed by Saarinen work ethic and his passion for architecture, and asked him to design some houses for Miller's use, as well as buildings for the Cummins engine factory and other companies that Miller owned. Miller, however, began to dream of patronage on a much larger scale. From 1954, he devised a brilliantly original program for Columbus, by which, as I mentioned, a foundation run by Miller paid the architectural fees for any public building, such as school, fire station, hospital, town hall, library, etc. They would pay the fees if the clients then allowed the foundation to select an architect, a range of architects, which then the client had to take a choice from and use one of them. The first building that was tested out was a school for the Columbus School Board, and it was designed by Harry Wees, and the system worked very well indeed, so it came to be repeated. This offer to pay all of the design fees was intended as a financial carrot to entice clients so that they would only use the very best modern architects in the United States. And as far as I know, it was a completely original idea that Miller came up with. His intention was to improve architectural and urban quality, and he was not in favour of any attachment to any particular architectural style, or indeed to the idea of the architect using the building to be as kind of a showpiece for their own work. Therefore, given the popularity of the scheme, he increasingly insisted that building clients had to spread around the jobs around an ever-increasing list of architects that he was becoming aware of. In that sense, it was very different from the Monte Carrazzo example we saw today. Thus, when the Columbus Board School came back to Miller to ask him for the fees, to pay the fees for another job, he said to them, "Well, yes, we will do that, but we will add a new request. That is, if you want to make this into a proper program to build schools, then we would like to see each school building but built by a different architect, not by the same one, no matter how happy you are with it. Because we think there is something good for the country if the best talent competes with each other and makes a new statement about a school. We would like to see a variety of statements about what a good school will be." In that quote from Miller, we can see his efforts to start to marry the benefits of a small town community life with a kind of design excellence and cultural richness that otherwise could only be afforded by large, much more cosmopolitan cities. It also showed his desire to promote architects who could preserve the older buildings as well as the modern buildings, and it's important to say that he promoted historical conservation as well as new schemes I'll show. As a result of this patronage by Lorenzo Miller, who was the sort of Lorenzo de' Medici of Columbus, Indiana, the town was graced by about 60 new buildings over the coming decades, all of architectural distinction, and by almost every young post-war American architect of any note. And I'll just show you some examples. This is the first Christian church, and it's like to the north of the town by Saarinen, built in the early 1960s. That's the exterior form, and this is the interior. This is just a small parish church in Columbus. Saarinen also designed the Irwin Trust Bank, one of the first fully glazed bank buildings in the centre of town, with this ingenious roof light system over it, and still today very much used as a centre for the banking. The Columbus Library was designed by I.M. Pei in the 1960s, late 60s, and this is the interior, again a small town library. The newspaper building, the local newspaper, was in this, designed by Myron Goldsmith, finished in 1971, which had a fully glazed facade, so you could see the newspapers being written and printed. The town hall, slightly later, by Edward Bassett of Skidmore, Owens and Merrill. This is a Baptist church by Harry Weiss, who was a today neglected modern architect, but seen as a very, very good architect at the time. And as I said, Venturi Scott Brown designed a couple of fire stations, of which this is probably the best known one. Critics claimed that Columbus was being turned into an architectural zoo, but Irwin Miller's aims were much less heroic, at least in his own mind. He always claimed that he had no desire to turn it into a model community. He simply wanted to create a standard of architecture that exceeded the expectations of a typical small town in America, of a modern population. What he did was to place his hometown onto the national and international stage. The tricky balance was also in trying to conserve the traditional qualities of the town he loved. The Columbus mentality may have its drawbacks, but it is offered a small town America a showpiece status which is not without its merits, wrote one of the designers in Britain of a new town called Milton Keynes, which tried to emulate very much this quality in the small community. In total, J. Irwin Miller spent about $14 million putting that into the scheme run by the Cummins Foundation, and with this being spread, as I mentioned, over about 60 buildings. Given that it was in effect the same as a 10% subsidy on building costs, it became an offer that no Columbus public authority could refuse. And in turn, it meant that Miller could bring in this cream of up-and-coming American architects. Although they all seem to us maybe like big names today, Miller deliberately commissioned them at a time when they were still relatively up-and-coming and hence fairly unknown. For this reason, he deliberately never asked established stars like Frank Lloyd Wright or Walter Gropius or Mies van der Rohe. Miller also had his own particular preferences and blind spots. For instance, he refused to include Louis Kahn because he found Louis Kahn far too difficult to get on with. And other architects that he nominated were not selected by the local bodies. Philip Johnson, for instance, was interviewed 3 times for a project in town and was turned down every time because of his personal attitude. It's also important to note that this commitment by Miller to high quality design was entirely genuine and ingrained. As I mentioned, he used Saarinen and Roos to design not just his own houses, but also the buildings for his company in Columbus. Later on, he asked Roos to design the Cummins engine components factory on the outskirts of Darlington in northeast England. And in the early 60s, and it became, in many ways, an overseas translation of this idea of a high-class architecture being put into an otherwise ordinary provincial town. To show you some of the schemes that he got built, in the centre of Columbus, this is the headquarters for his the Cummins Engine Company, designed by Kevin Roche and built, finished in the 1980s. And it's a public park as well in the centre of town, as well as the headquarters. He also, as I mentioned, got Saarinen to design the housing, his own houses. One a holiday house in Canada, but the main one is this house on the outskirts of Columbus, which is a fascinating example of mid-50s modernism. This was designed by Saarinen, and it shows a very simple classical 9-square plan with different activities in the corners and then the living spaces in the middle, with a facade, these central areas which could be opened up and extended out into the surroundings, seen as one of the most important modern houses of its time. And this is Miller at home with the family. The programme turned Columbus into the most remarkable architectural showcase of mid-20th century modernism almost anywhere. Strangest of all, this collection of archigems is found in a modest settlement which could still extol the democratic, homely and Christian values of small-town America, with much of Miller's investment, as I said, having gone into preserving the historical fabric of the town. Miller was an athlete and a multi-millionaire who could quite easily have decided to move to a major city and enjoyed many pleasures there. Instead, he remained faithful to the small, primarily agricultural community where he was raised. As the local people came to say, the town became his monument. Rather than leaving home, he imported learned architectural taste to Main Street, USA. Indeed, it was precisely this desire to enrich the everyday suburban values of Columbus through rigorous modern buildings that was his kind of great vision. Miller also extended his architectural connoisseurship to his alma mater, Yale University, and was instrumental in getting that major building programmed. You probably know from Yale from the 1950s, including Saarinen famous ice rink. His own architectural values were definitely hard-headed and rational. Most of all, he liked the pragmatic, flexible design approach of people like Saarinen and Roche. In Miller's own words, they were problem solvers who addressed the client's needs directly, rather than that kind of architect who used the projects to preen their own personal vanity. To conclude, the tale of Columbus is a fascinating one, even if it was ultimately a failed experiment. But perhaps all buildings are failed experiments to some extent, and it is through their failure that we can learn. So what then does Columbus tell us about the possibility and precariousness of architecture outside the major economic centres? Part of its failure laid in the complacent Americanism of the programme. Irwin Miller never used any non-American architects in order to keep that kind of US Midwest community feel going, but he said to me he later regretted that. Secondly, the talented up-and-coming architects that he brought in were never in any sense part of that local community, and often it seems they did not care that much about it either. He noted bitterly that some of the architects who were given jobs at the early part of their career later on refused to come back to work in the town when they were offered jobs, which suggests a layer of opportunism, if not cynicism, about their intentions compared to Miller's. However, the major problem was that the experiment could not cope with time and decay. As Miller himself said to me in his own words, "You're always aware that you can never quite get rid of the process of decay. If you can improve a little faster than the decay, why then that is a great achievement, but decay is always going on." In major metropolitan centres, the forces of cultural and economic renewal and redirection are more numerous and diverse, and therefore more deeply embedded. It means that processes of adaptation and regeneration are more likely to keep occurring. Architectural production away from the main population centres sounds like a liberating and in many ways a romantic notion, but the question is how to make it sustainable over time. The Irwin Miller model of enlightened patronage is definitely not sustainable, because when the Lorenzo de' Medici figure dies, there is usually nobody else to keep it going. The sands of time are of course around us everywhere, but perhaps they happen with greater speed in places outside the main population centres. Most of all, however, it points to problems of conception of centre and periphery, which, has been mentioned by several speakers so far, are now almost meaningless terms in a globalising world. Instead, these notions, like centre-periphery, are fluid and always changing, making a mockery of our aspirations and our experiments. Changes will happen, and globalisation is constantly producing new differences and opportunities, but not homogenisation. "Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair," wrote Coleridge in his poem about the ruins of Ozymandias. Time is the factor we need to keep our eye upon. Thank you.